Welcome to Warhammer 40,000 Lore to Sleep To. Today we'll be exploring the origins and other details of Angron, Primarch of the World Eaters Legiones Astartes. So lie back, relax, and let's begin. The Primarch who was never meant to be a monster. Of all the 20 Primarchs scattered across the stars by the Chaos Gods, many met dark fates. Some fell to pride, some to ambition, some to whispered promises in the long cold between worlds. But Angron stands apart from nearly all of them. His story is not one of corruption in the traditional sense. It is not a tale of a noble soul slowly seduced by darkness. It is something quieter, and in many ways far more painful than that. Angron's tragedy is one of circumstance. Of a life defined not by choices freely made, but by suffering inflicted before he ever had the chance to become who he might have been. He is mourned even by those who study him most closely, not because of what he did, but because of what was done to him. Long before he ever set foot on a battlefield as a Primarch, long before he ever raised a weapon in the name of the Emperor, the course of his life had already been decided by the cruelty of others. He is, in the truest sense, a figure defined by tragedy rather than malice. In the grand sweep of the Horus heresy, there are Primarchs who teetered on the edge and were pulled back. There are those who found brotherhood, purpose, redemption, or at least a measure of peace within the structure of the Great Crusade. Even those who eventually fell, often had moments of grace. Moments where another path seemed possible. Angron was not afforded those moments. From the very first instant the Emperor found him, the window for salvation was already narrowing. The butcher's nails had been hammering away at his mind for years by that point, shearing off pieces of who he was, and replacing them with pain and fury. Every attempt to reach him, every outstretched hand, every word of kinship offered by a brother Primarch, crashed against that wall of agony. He could not receive comfort because the part of him capable of receiving it was already badly damaged. Where others were lifted up by the crusade, Angron was simply carried forward by it, like a stone in a current, grinding away against everything around him. He was never truly saved, not because no one tried, but because the damage had been done, long before anyone came looking. Angron is sometimes described as the worst-treated Primarch. It is a difficult title to assign, given the suffering that touched so many of the Emperor's sons. And yet, when one traces the full arc of Angron's life from his earliest days on the dust and blood of Nuceria to his eventual apotheosis into demonhood, the argument carries real weight. He was taken from a battlefield where he had chosen to die alongside those he loved, conscripted into a purpose he never asked for, and denied even the mercy of ending things on his own terms. The Emperor lifted him from that hillside not out of tenderness, but out of necessity. And in doing so, robbed him of the only active agency he had left. From that moment, Angron existed in a state of permanent grievance, not the petulant grievance of a spoiled soul, but the deep, bone-level grievance of someone who understood exactly what had been taken from him. He was never consulted. He was never comforted in any meaningful way. He was handed a legion and pointed at the enemy, and the slow ruin of everything he was, continued uninterrupted. Few of his brothers endured so much, for so long, with so little given in return. Angron's original personality may have been erased by the butcher's nails. This is perhaps the most haunting thread in all of Angron's story. The butcher's nails were a crude and barbaric piece of cortical technology, implanted into the skulls of gladiatorial slaves on Nuceria to make them fight harder, longer, and with less regard for their own survival. They functioned by stimulating aggression and simultaneously blocking the neural pathways associated with calm, contentment, and positive emotional reward. In short, they made peace feel like pain, and violence feel like relief. For an ordinary human being, this was devastating enough. For a Primarch, a being of extraordinary psychic potential and cognitive depth, the long-term effects are almost impossible to fully calculate. By the time Angron was recovered by the Emperor, The nails had already been working on him for years. What memories remained of his earlier self, what instincts, what ways of thinking and feeling and connecting with others, had been slowly, methodically ground away. The person Angron might have been was not lost in a single dramatic moment. He was eroded, worn down, particle by particle, like a stone beneath a river, until what remained was unrecognizable even to those who might once have known him. What the nails left behind was not truly Angron. It was the shape of him, filled with suffering. Before the scattering, before Nuceria, before any of it, the Emperor had a design in mind for each of his sons. Each Primarch was crafted with specific qualities, specific roles, specific virtues that would serve the Great Crusade in particular ways. And for Angron, that original template was something closer to a paladin than a berserker. The word carries weight. A paladin is not simply a warrior. A paladin is a warrior with a code, a defender of something, a figure who couples martial might with moral purpose. This was the soul the Emperor intended to build into his son's genetic architecture. A being capable of immense strength and courage, yes, but one who would wield those qualities in service of something larger than mere destruction. It is a striking contrast to the figure Angron eventually became. And it matters, because it reminds us that what we see when we look at the Red Angel is not an inevitable outcome. It was not written into his design from the beginning. The monster the galaxy came to know was made, not born. Something intervened between the Emperor's intentions and the reality that emerged, and that something is what makes Angron's story so quietly devastating to sit with. Following on from the concept of the Paladin, there is a detail even more striking, buried within the lore surrounding Angron's original design. Some interpretations suggest that empathy, genuine functional empathy, may have been a deliberate component of his genetic architecture. Not merely the capacity for loyalty or brotherhood that many Primarchs shared, but something more finely tuned. A sensitivity to the suffering of others. An awareness of pain that was meant to make him a protector as much as a destroyer. If this is true, then the cruelty of what the butcher's nails did to him takes on an added dimension of horror. Because the nails did not simply suppress aggression control or damage impulse regulation. They attacked the very faculties that would have made Angron most himself. They silenced precisely the qualities the Emperor had most carefully cultivated. His capacity to feel the pain of others was twisted inward, turned into a receptivity to his own agony, until the empathy that might have defined him became nothing more than a conduit for suffering. What was meant to connect him to humanity was used as a weapon against him. It is difficult to imagine a more complete or more deliberate form of destruction. Glimpses of who Angron truly was, before the nails do their worst, are rare, and they arrive in fragments. A word here, a moment there, filtered through the accounts of those who witnessed him in calmer states, or who encountered echoes of his earlier self in his behavior toward those he chose to protect. What those fragments suggest is surprising, given the figure he eventually became. Angron was principled. He held to a code that, while brutal in context, was internally consistent and morally legible. He valued loyalty above nearly everything. He despised betrayal. He cared about the people directly beneath his protection with an intensity that read less like the attachment of a commander and more like the devotion of a guardian. These are not the qualities of a mindless engine of destruction. They are the qualities of someone who had thought carefully about what mattered, even within the grinding horror of gladiatorial slavery, and had arrived at a set of convictions he would not abandon. The tragedy is that these convictions survived just long enough to be used against him, to make his eventual debasement more complete. A man without principles cannot truly be broken. Angron could be, and was. Among the Primarchs, roles emerged naturally from both design and circumstance. Some were builders, some were diplomats, some were siege specialists or void tacticians. And yes, some were shock troops, warriors whose purpose was to break the enemy through sheer overwhelming ferocity. But Angron was not originally intended to fill that particular niche. The berserker role, the howling, blood-maddened vanguard that the World Eaters eventually became, was not the destiny his genetic template pointed toward. That archetype was something imposed upon him by circumstance and by the nails, not something drawn out from his truest nature. It is worth pausing on this, because it reframes the entire history of the World Eaters' Legion. Their identity, their culture, their very way of war, was not an expression of what their Primarch was supposed to be. It was a reflection of what had been done to him. An entire legion shaped in the image of their gene-father's trauma rather than his gift. Every World Eater who ever charged screaming into a melee was, in some sense, reenacting the trauma inflicted on Nuceria rather than fulfilling any grand martial purpose. The Legion was built on a foundation of damage, and carried that damage into every war they ever fought. There is a moment, recorded within the lore and precious in its rarity, where the butcher's nails fell silent. Where whatever mechanism of psychic interference or medical intervention briefly interrupted their endless gnawing, and Angron existed in something approaching stillness. Accounts of what he was like in that state are sparse and fragmented, as one might expect of something so fleeting and so difficult to fully comprehend for those who witnessed it. But the consensus is quiet and consistent. He was calm. Not the flat dissociated calm of someone sedated beyond feeling, but something more genuine than that. A calm that came from the inside. The fury did not simply pause. It was, for a short time, absent. And in its place was something recognizably Angron, something that reflected the person he had been designed to become, rather than the creature the nails had made of him. Those who were present describe a different quality to his presence entirely. Something less like standing near a furnace and more like standing in a room that had recently been filled with warmth. It did not last. The nails reasserted themselves, as they always did. But for that brief window, something true and unborrowed flickered in the Red Angel's eyes. Amongst the thousands of warriors who wore the Legion's colors and bore the genetic legacy of Angron in their blood, there was one who reached him. One name that appears in the accounts of this period not as a general or a champion or a figure of battlefield renown, but as something quieter and more significant than any of those titles. Angron showed this Astartes warmth. Genuine, unprompted warmth, of the kind that those around Angron had long since stopped expecting to witness. It was not the brutal affection of a commander who values a useful weapon. It was something more personal than that. Something that suggested the part of Angron capable of caring about individuals had not been entirely destroyed, only buried so deeply beneath the screaming of the nails that it rarely if ever surfaced. The relationship between a Primarch and a single Astartes is, in the vast scale of this universe, a very small thing. But in Angron's story, it carries enormous weight. It is evidence, fragile and precious, that something of him survived. That the paladin the Emperor had intended to build had not been completely unmade. That beneath all the damage, a man was still present, however rarely he was permitted to breathe. Even the Emperor admitted his rage was justified. This is perhaps the most damning detail of all. In a saga filled with tragedy and with culpability spread across many hands, there is one admission that cuts through everything else with unusual clarity. The Emperor, the architect of the Great Crusade, the figure of supreme authority in this entire history, acknowledged that Angron's anger was not irrational. It was not the product of weakness or moral failure. It was not simply the nails talking, though the nails had certainly amplified it beyond measure. The rage was real, and it was earned. Angron had been taken from a battlefield against his will. He had been denied the death he had chosen for himself and for those he loved. He had been handed a legion built on pain and pointed at the stars with no acknowledgement of what it had cost him to stand there. And the Emperor, who could have done otherwise and chose not to, knew this. That knowledge makes every subsequent event in Angron's story heavier to carry. Because it means the tragedy was not a misunderstanding. It was not a failure of communication or a gap in the Emperor's knowledge. It was a choice. And Angron, who never had the luxury of choices, paid for it every single day of his existence. The fall to Nuceria. The story of Angron does not begin with the gladiatorial sands of Nuceria. It begins earlier, and darker than that. Before he ever drew breath in any meaningful sense, before he had a name or a world or a single memory to call his own, forces older than the Imperium had already decided he should not exist. The Eldar, those ancient and far-seeing inhabitants of a civilization that predated humanity's first cities, looked ahead along the threads of fate and did not like what they found there. What they saw when they looked at the infant Primarch was not a child. It was a convergence. A point around which suffering and slaughter would accumulate on a scale that even they, with all their gifts of foresight, found difficult to fully contemplate. And so they moved against him, as they had moved against others, with the cold and terrible pragmatism of a species that had learned to treat prophecy as instruction. They failed, as such attempts against the Primarch so often did. But the attempt itself tells us something important. Even before the nails, even before Nuceria, the universe had already marked Angron as significant. What a bitter thing, to be noticed so early, for reasons so entirely beyond your control. Names carry weight in the lore of the Primarchs. They are often the first clue to who a person was, before the galaxy reshaped them, before legion colors and battlefield titles and the long grinding work of war replaced whatever had come before. Angron's original name was Angronius. It is a softer name than the one history remembers him by. There is something almost classical in its construction, something that speaks to a different set of expectations than the blood-soaked title the World Eaters eventually gave their father. Angronius suggests lineage and identity, a name given with some intention behind it, even if that intention was formed in the brutal context of Nuceria's slave society. It is worth sitting with that name for a moment. The man who became one of the most feared and destructive beings in the history of the galaxy was once simply Angronius. A child with a name. A person before he was a symbol, before he was a weapon, before he was a demon. The distance between that name and the Red Angel he eventually became is not just a matter of years or battles or suffering, though all of those contributed. It is the distance between a person and what a person can be reduced to. Beyond Angronius, there is an additional layer to his name that appears in certain accounts and translations. The full form, incorporating the designation Thalca, adds a dimension of cultural specificity that grounds him more firmly in the particular world and circumstances of his origin. Names in cultures shaped by hardship and hierarchy often carry functional meanings, identifiers that speak to status, origin, or expectation. The inclusion of Thalca in Angron's original name is suggestive of exactly that kind of layered identity. It places him within a specific social and geographical context on Nuceria, tying him not just to the gladiatorial system in the abstract but to a particular lineage within it. There is something poignant about preserving this detail, because it insists on a specificity that the broader sweep of his story tends to erase. Angron is so often discussed in grand cosmic terms, as a figure of mythology rather than of history, that it becomes easy to forget the smaller, more intimate details of his origins. The full name is a reminder that he came from somewhere. That he had a specific place in a specific world, with specific people around him. That before he was legend, he was simply a person with a name too long for most to remember. Nuceria was not a gentle world. Its arenas were vast and sun-baked, and the sand that covered their floors was stained in a way that spoke to generations of violence conducted upon it. The red sand is not merely a physical description. It is a symbolic touchstone that runs through the entirety of Angron's story on Nuceria, a recurring image that binds together his suffering, his defiance, and the particular texture of the world that shaped him. To fight on the red sand was to exist within a system designed to extract everything from a person and return nothing. It was entertainment for those with the luxury of watching, and survival for those with no other choice. Angron did not choose the red sand. He was placed upon it, as so many were, and discovered that the only language it rewarded was the language of violence. What he did with that discovery, the skill he developed, the will he maintained, the identity he carved out in the midst of something designed to unmake identity entirely, speaks to a quality in him that the nails never fully destroyed. The red sand tried to reduce him to a function. He refused, for as long as he was capable of refusing, to be only that. In the arena culture of Nuceria, reputation was everything. It was the only currency available to those who owned nothing else, and it was bought at a price most could not afford to pay for long. To survive was an achievement. To win consistently was remarkable. To go unbeaten across the span of years that Angron competed was something else entirely, something that passed beyond the realm of mere skill and entered into the territory of legend. The title he earned, the Unbeaten, was not given lightly in a culture that valued martial excellence above almost everything else. It meant that every opponent set against him had failed to end him. It meant that the system, which had every incentive to eventually destroy him as a crowd-pleasing finale, had been unable to do so. There is a grim kind of pride available in that record, even if the setting in which it was achieved was one of absolute horror. Angron did not triumph because he enjoyed the violence, though the nails increasingly made it difficult for him to distinguish enjoyment from relief. He remained unbeaten because he was a Primarch, yes, but also because something in him refused to yield. The title is an epitaph for the man he was trying to remain. Beyond the title of the Unbeaten, Angron's dominance on Nuceria eventually elevated him to something closer to an institution than an individual. Lord of the Red Sands is a title that carries a different kind of weight. Where the Unbeaten speaks to personal victory, Lord of the Red Sands speaks to authority, to the kind of presence that reshapes the space around it. In the context of the gladiatorial world, it meant that he had become the central figure around which the entire enterprise of the arena was organized. Other fighters were measured against him. Crowds gathered in anticipation of seeing him. The machinery of Nucerian entertainment had built itself, in part, around his continued existence. It is an ironic kind of power for a man who was enslaved. The system that owned him had also, in a very practical sense, come to depend upon him. And Angron understood this, as his later choices would demonstrate. He used what leverage it afforded him, not for personal gain, not to secure comfort or status, but to protect those beneath him. The Lord of the Red Sands was not a title he wore with pride, so much as a tool he held in his hands and tried, for as long as he could, to use for something other than what it was designed for. Within the brutal closed world of the gladiatorial slave circuit, genuine human connection was both rare and dangerous. To care about someone was to hand the system a lever it could use against you. And yet, within that context, a relationship formed between Angron and an older gladiator named Enamors that transcended the transactional bonds that defined most interactions in that environment. Enamors was a mentor, a protector in the early years, a figure who saw something in the young Primarch and chose to invest in it rather than exploit it. Whether he understood what Angron truly was is unclear. But he responded to him as a person, and in doing so provided something that Angron had no other source for: guidance, steadiness, a model of how to remain a person within a system designed to strip personhood away. The word father is used carefully here, because it carries implications of choice and devotion that the law does not always fully support. But in the absence of any other candidate, in the absence of any other figure who occupied that role, Enamors stands as the closest approximation. He gave Angron something to hold on to. And what happened later between them is made incalculably more painful by everything that preceded it. The butcher's nails were not Angron's idea. It is a detail so fundamental to understanding Angron that it bears stating plainly and without embellishment. He did not choose the butcher's nails. He did not request them, agree to them, or in any way consent to their implantation. They were not a tool he sought out to make himself more dangerous, not an enhancement he welcomed in pursuit of some personal ambition. They were done to him. The agency in the transaction belonged entirely to his enslavers, and their motivation had nothing to do with his well-being or his development as a warrior. The nails were a control mechanism dressed up in the language of augmentation, a way of managing a being who was becoming difficult to manage through conventional means. That this is sometimes forgotten, or passed over in accounts that focus more on Angron's eventual violence than on its origins, represents a significant failure of moral accounting. Everything the nails did to him, every pathway they severed, every moment of peace they denied him, every relationship they made harder to sustain, every year of his life they spent grinding away at who he was, happened without his permission. He was a victim of the nails before he was ever defined by them. That sequence of events matters enormously. The specific circumstances surrounding the implantation of the butcher's nails into Angron are grimly instructive. They were not implanted as part of some standard process applied to all gladiators on Nuceria. They were targeted. They were personal. They were, in the most straightforward reading of the available accounts, a punishment. Something Angron had done, some act of defiance or resistance, or simple refusal to be entirely what his enslavers required of him, prompted a response designed to bring him to heel in a way that physical coercion alone had failed to achieve. The message embedded in that decision is not subtle. It says that the people who owned him recognized his capacity for selfhood and found it inconvenient. It says that his ability to think, to refuse, to maintain an interior life that the arena did not control, was perceived as a threat serious enough to warrant a surgical intervention in his mind. They could not break him from the outside, so they reached inside instead. The nails were the Nucerians' answer to the problem of a slave who would not stop being a person. And the answer they chose was to make personhood itself a source of pain, and violence a source of relief. It is difficult to imagine a more deliberate act of cruelty. The physical damage inflicted by the butcher's nails was not limited to the neural pathways they were designed to target. Over the years of their operation, the crude and poorly calibrated technology worked its destruction far more broadly than any conventional medical implant would have. The scarring they left behind was not merely functional, not simply a matter of altered behavior and suppressed emotional response. It was structural. The tissue of Angron's brain bore the marks of their presence in ways that went beyond what any surgical removal could have fully reversed. Even if the nails had been extracted cleanly and completely, the landscape of his mind would have remained altered. The cellular architecture had been reshaped around their presence, the way a tree grows around a wire embedded in its wood over many years. This is important because it closes off certain avenues of hope in his story. The idea that removing the nails would have restored him to some prior version of himself rests on an assumption the biological reality does not support. Too much had been changed. Too much had been overwritten. The man he might have been without them existed only in the theoretical space of what could have been, and the nails had made even that space difficult to access. The butcher's nails were, by any reasonable technical assessment, a catastrophically poor piece of engineering when applied to a Primarch's physiology. Designed for ordinary human gladiators, they were not calibrated for the extraordinary neural and biological complexity of a being like Angron. The consequences of this mismatch were not merely psychological. They were physical, ongoing, and severe. Among the documented effects were chronic difficulties with breathing, the result of neural interference with the involuntary systems that most beings operate without conscious thought. There were episodes of cranial pressure, of a quality and regularity that would have been debilitating in an ordinary human. There was damage that accumulated slowly but relentlessly, adding layer upon layer to an already catastrophic foundation. Angron existed in a state of constant physical suffering in addition to the psychological torment the nails were designed to produce. The rage that defined him was not simply a psychological response to trauma. It was also, in a very literal sense, a pain response. He was a being in chronic agony, whose only neurological relief came from the one activity the nails were designed to encourage. He was trapped inside his own body as surely as he was trapped on the red sand, and the trap was just as deliberately constructed. The moment when Angron killed Enamors is one of the most devastating in his entire story, and it requires some care in the telling. By the time it happened, the nails had already been working on Angron for long enough to make certain outcomes increasingly unavoidable. The mechanism was simple and terrible. The nails rewarded aggression and punished restraint. In a situation of sufficient physical or emotional intensity, they could overwhelm conscious control entirely, reducing even a Primarch to a creature of pure reactive violence. And so the man who had been the closest thing Angron possessed to a father, the mentor who had seen him as a person when the rest of the world refused to, died at Angron's hands. Not because Angron wished it. Not because he chose it. But because the thing in his skull that was slowly eating him alive, took that choice away. What followed was not the flat indifference of a broken mind. It was grief. Howling, sustained, inconsolable grief that lasted for days. The nails could suppress many things, but they could not suppress this, at least not immediately. The horror of what he had done reached him. He felt it in full. And then the nails went back to work, and the man who could feel that horror became a little harder to find. By the end of his time on Nuceria, and certainly by the time the Emperor came to claim him, the phrase unbound rage had become less a description of Angron's emotional state and more a description of his fundamental condition. It was not that he was angry in the way that a person can be angry, with a specific cause, a specific object, a beginning and a possible end. It was that the neurological infrastructure required to regulate, contextualize, or resolve anger had been so thoroughly damaged, that rage had become the medium he existed within, rather than a response he experienced. Think of it less as an emotion and more as a weather system. Constant, pervasive, and with no clear mechanism for resolution available to those inside it. The tragedy of this is not simply that it made him dangerous, though it certainly did that. The tragedy is that somewhere inside that weather system, there was still a person. Still a will, still a set of values, still a capacity for connection that surfaced occasionally and unexpectedly, like a landmark, glimpsed briefly through storm clouds before the view closed over again. Unbound rage was what the world saw. What the world saw was not all that was there. But the nails made certain it was all that most people ever encountered. The Red Angel rises. There came a point on Nuceria when endurance was no longer enough. When surviving the arena, winning on the red sand, accumulating the grim currency of reputation and fear, ceased to feel like any kind of answer to the question of what to do with a life spent in chains. Angron reached that point, and when he did not simply withdraw into himself or accept the horizon that had been drawn around him. He organized. The gladiator revolt he led was not a spontaneous eruption of violence, though violence was certainly its instrument. It was a considered act, as considered as anything could be in the circumstances, driven by a clarity of purpose that cut through the constant noise of the nails with unusual force. He gathered those around him, those who had survived long enough to trust him and be trusted in return, and he turned the skills the arena had forced upon them toward a different objective. Not entertainment. Not survival within the system. Escape from it entirely. The revolt stands as one of the most significant acts of Angron's mortal life, not because of its military dimensions, but because of what it reveals about him. Even at his most damaged, even with the nails hammering away at every higher impulse, he was capable of choosing something larger than himself. It is easy, looking back across the full span of Angron's story, to assume that the title Red Angel belongs to his demonic incarnation, to the vast, blood-soaked entity that emerged from the final working of the butcher's nails and the blessing of the blood god. But the title is older than that. It predates his fall to chaos, predates his ascension, predates even his induction into the Imperium. The name Red Angel was given to him on Nuceria, by people who had watched him fight and survive, and refused to be extinguished across years of the most brutal conditions imaginable. It was a title born of witness, not of mythology. Those who named him thus were not speaking of a demon or a divine instrument of destruction. They were speaking of a man they had seen do things on the red sand that seemed to exceed the boundaries of what a person was supposed to be capable of. There is something deeply poignant in knowing this. The name that would eventually become synonymous with one of the most terrible beings in the galaxy was first spoken by slaves, in admiration and in something approaching awe, for a man who was fighting, however imperfectly, to be free. The angel came before the monster. The title outlasted the person it was first given to. During the revolt and the period of open conflict that followed it, the force Angron commanded on Nuceria earned a name that reflected both their methods and their intentions. The Eaters of Cities. It is a title that carries an unmistakable quality of total war, of a force that did not draw distinctions between military targets and the broader structures of the society that had created and sustained their enslavement. To eat a city is to consume everything it represents, its walls and its institutions and the hierarchies sheltering behind both. The name speaks to an anger that was not interested in negotiation or reform, that had moved beyond asking for anything from the system that had produced it, and was concerned only with tearing that system down, as completely as possible. This is not difficult to understand in context. These were people who had been owned, who had been implanted and conditioned and fed into an entertainment machine that required their suffering to function. The Eaters of Cities were not criminals pursuing personal gain. They were an inevitable consequence of what Nuceria had done to them for generations. Angron understood this, and he led accordingly. Not with the restraint of someone hoping for a negotiated settlement, but with the absolute commitment of someone who had nothing left to lose. Even within the confines of a system designed to grind people into nothing, certain individuals become something more than the system intended. Angron's time on the red sand produced a reputation that operated on a different scale to that of even the most successful gladiators Nuceria had seen before him. He became a legend, in the specific sense that his name carried weight beyond the arena that had made it. Stories about him spread, in the way that stories about the genuinely extraordinary always do, carried by people who had witnessed something they could not fully account for, within the ordinary frameworks of expectation. Part of this was the Primarch's nature. He was, by any objective measure, operating at a level of physical and martial capability that no unaugmented human opponent could match. But legend is not made only from capability. It is made from the combination of capability with character, with the sense that the person performing these feats is inhabited in some meaningful way, that there is a will behind the skill that makes the whole thing more than mere performance. Angron's legend rested on exactly that combination. He was not simply unbeatable. He was present in his unbeatability in a way that left witnesses with the conviction that they had seen something that mattered, even if they could not fully articulate why. The intellectual and moral framework that Angron would carry with him long after leaving Nuceria, the particular way he thought about freedom and bondage and what a person owes to those who share their chains, did not arrive fully formed from somewhere outside his experience. It was built on the red sand, forged in the specific conditions of gladiatorial slavery, and refined through years of living within a system that made the questions of liberty and obligation more immediate and more consequential than most people ever have to face. His philosophy was not abstract. It was not the product of reading or contemplation in comfortable surroundings. It was earned through direct experience of what it meant to be owned, and what it cost to resist being defined by that ownership. At its core, his thinking held that the bonds between those who suffer together are the only bonds that carry genuine moral weight. That loyalty earned in chains is the only loyalty worth trusting. And that freedom, when it comes, must be shared or it means nothing at all. These convictions shaped every significant decision he made for the rest of his life. They shaped how he led the revolt. They shaped how he related to his legion. And they shaped, with particular bitterness, how he experienced what the Emperor did to him on Nuceria. Each of the Primarchs who eventually fell carried their own particular wound into the heresy, their own specific point of failure or betrayal or despair that the Chaos Gods found and pressed upon. For Angron, that wound was abandonment. Not the abstract abandonment of being scattered across the galaxy as an infant, which all the Primarchs shared in common. Something more specific and more personal than that. The feeling, consistent and unresolved across the entirety of his time within the Imperium, that no one in a position of authority had ever truly attempted to help him. That he had been observed in his suffering, assessed in terms of his usefulness, and integrated into a structure that required his damage to function without anyone ever seriously asking whether the damage could be repaired. This sense of abandonment was not paranoia. It was not the nails generating an irrational emotional response. It was a conclusion drawn from a consistent pattern of experience that the facts of his story do not contradict. He was abandoned, first by the universe that placed him on Nuceria, then by the Emperor who took him from it without addressing any of the reasons Nuceria had been so harmful. The feeling was accurate. That made it worse, not better. Among the details that complicate any simple reading of the Emperor's relationship with Angron, this one carries particular weight. Of all 20 Primarchs scattered to the far corners of the galaxy, Angron was the first to be physically located and retrieved by the Emperor in person. Not discovered by scouts, not identified through intermediaries, but found. The Emperor came himself, as he did for several of the Primarchs, and this was an event of enormous significance in the mythology of the Great Crusade. And yet the circumstances of that finding were unlike those of almost any other Primarch reunion. There was no triumphant meeting of father and son. No embrace, no formal acknowledgement of kinship, no moment of mutual recognition that was permitted to resolve into something warm. The Emperor arrived in the middle of a battle, in the middle of a revolt that Angron had spent years building toward, and what followed was not reunion in any meaningful sense. It was intervention. The distinction matters. Being found first should have meant something. Should have suggested a particular importance, a particular investment of attention and care. What it meant in practice was that Angron became the first to experience what it was like to be the Emperor's son and feel entirely alone in that fact. When the Emperor came to Nuceria and made himself known to Angron, the expected choreography of such a meeting, the acknowledgement of a greater power, the formal submission that would mark the beginning of a new relationship, did not occur. Angron refused to kneel. This is not a small detail in the context of the Imperium, where hierarchy was not merely a matter of protocol but a foundational principle, around which the entire project of the Great Crusade was organized. For any other being in the galaxy to refuse the Emperor's implicit expectation of deference would have carried serious consequences. But Angron was a Primarch, and more than that, he was a Primarch in the middle of something that mattered to him more than any cosmic father he had never met. He did not kneel because he did not recognize the claim being made on him. He had not been raised in the Imperium. He had no context for the Emperor's authority that was not filtered through the experience of having his choices taken away by those who claimed power over him. From where Angron stood, a being arriving and expecting submission was simply another form of the thing he had spent his entire life resisting. He had not survived Nuceria by kneeling. The refusal to kneel was not a single moment of defiance that passed and was later resolved. It was a posture Angron maintained throughout his time within the Imperium with a consistency that spoke to the depth of the conviction behind it. He never formally bowed to the Emperor. Not in the initial meeting, not in the period that followed, not in the various formal and ceremonial contexts that the structure of the Great Crusade produced. This was noticed. It was remarked upon by those around him, both among his brother Primarchs and within the broader hierarchy of the Imperium. And it was, in one interpretation, a constant minor act of rebellion within a situation from which he had no larger means of escape. He could not leave. He could not undo what the Emperor had done to him on Nuceria. He could not recover the companions he had lost, or return to the life he had been building. But he could refuse to perform deference to the being responsible for all of it. The bow was the one thing he could withhold. And he withheld it absolutely, for as long as he drew mortal breath. It is a small defiance in the scale of his story, but it is entirely characteristic of the man. He had never kneeled when the cost of standing was clear. He did not begin now. The first contact between Angron and the forces accompanying the Emperor on Nuceria was not a diplomatic exchange or a careful introduction. It was a fight. Angron, in the middle of his revolt, surrounded by the companions he had led and protected and fought alongside, encountered the Imperials as an intrusion into a situation that was already critical, and he responded in the way that every instinct he possessed, amplified and distorted as those instincts were by the nails, demanded he respond. He attacked. This is sometimes presented in accounts as evidence of Angron's irrationality, as a demonstration of how far the nails had already taken him from the capacity for measured response. And it is true that the nails would have made de-escalation extraordinarily difficult for him in that moment. But it is also true that from his perspective, unknown armed forces arriving in the midst of a battle he was fighting, for his life and for the lives of those he cared about, were not an obvious source of assistance. The attack was not madness. It was, given everything he knew and everything he had experienced, a reasonable response to the information available to him. That it happened to be wrong in this specific instance is the kind of thing that becomes easier to judge from a safe distance. What the Emperor did next is, depending on one's perspective, either an act of pragmatic necessity or the most consequential and damaging mistake in his entire relationship with his son. As Angron's revolt reached its final moments, as the forces arrayed against his gladiators closed in and the outcome became increasingly clear, the Emperor removed Angron from the battlefield by force. Not at a moment of natural pause. Not after the fight had concluded one way or another. Mid-battle. While the companions Angron had fought beside for years were still alive, still fighting, still dying around him. He was taken from them without warning, without consent, without the opportunity to make a choice about whether to go. One moment he was present. The next he was elsewhere, and the people he had chosen to die alongside were left without him on a battlefield they could not win. The Emperor may have calculated that removing Angron was the most efficient way to secure his son's survival. He was not wrong about the arithmetic. But the cost of that calculation was paid not by the Emperor, but by Angron, who would carry the weight of those deaths for the remainder of his existence, and who never forgave the being who had made that choice on his behalf. Grief and blame arrived together for Angron in the aftermath of the teleportation, and they fused into something that the nails could not dissolve and time could not erode. The gladiators who had revolted with him, the people who had trusted him and followed him and built something together out of the wreckage of their enslaved lives, died on Nuceria without him. He had not been there to fight beside them at the end. He had not been permitted to share their fate. And in his understanding of the moral weight of that fact, the responsibility lay with the Emperor. Not abstractly or metaphorically, but directly. The Emperor had made the choice to remove him. The Emperor had overridden his autonomy at the moment when it mattered most. And the Emperor had provided him with no subsequent acknowledgement that anything had been lost, no reckoning with the cost of what had been done. Angron's rage at this was not irrational. It was proportionate. His people were dead because a more powerful being had decided his continuation was more valuable than their lives, and had not consulted him on that decision. The fact that the Emperor had the authority to make such a choice did not make the choice right. Angron never pretended otherwise, and he was not wrong to refuse to do so. In the immediate aftermath of his removal from the battlefield, Angron did something that is rarely emphasized in the broader narrative of his story. He asked to go back. Not in the language of command or threat, but in something closer to appeal. He wanted to return to Nuceria. To be there for the conclusion of what had been started, to stand with the people he had led and to share whatever end they faced, rather than be preserved at their expense. This is a detail that matters because of what it reveals about how he understood his own obligations. His philosophy, built on the red sand over years of shared suffering, held that the bonds forged in chains carried an absolute moral weight. That you did not abandon the people who had trusted you with their lives. He was not asking to go back out of a death wish or a strategic calculation. He was asking because leaving felt like a betrayal so fundamental that survival on those terms was almost meaningless. The Emperor denied the request. Whatever reasoning lay behind that denial, whether pragmatism or timeline or simply the expectation that Angron would eventually adapt, the effect was to compound the original injury with a second one. He was not only taken. He was told he could not return. The resentment Angron carried toward the Emperor was not built in a single moment. It accumulated, layer upon layer, across the years of the Great Crusade, each interaction or failure of interaction adding its increment to something that had been structurally inevitable from the day he was teleported away from Nuceria. The Emperor had found him, conscripted him, given him a legion, pointed him at the enemy, and provided him with remarkably little else. The butcher's nails remained. The Mechanicum's assessments, where they existed at all, concluded that removal was impossible or inadvisable without addressing the fundamental question of what Angron's life was like with them in place. And the Emperor, who possessed knowledge and resources that exceeded those of any other being in the Imperium, made no sustained effort to resolve the situation. Angron knew this. He was many things, but he was not unintelligent, and the absence of genuine help was not something he failed to notice. What he experienced was the specific, corrosive resentment of someone who can see that assistance is possible, who has reasonable grounds to expect it, and who watches it fail to arrive across years and decades, while those around him offer explanations that never quite account for the gap. Part of what defined the experience of many Primarchs who were eventually found and integrated into the Great Crusade was the existence of a prior human life. Families, however unconventional, who had raised them on whatever world they had fallen to. People who had known them before they were Primarchs, who had related to them as individuals rather than as assets or symbols. These relationships grounded many of the Emperor's sons in a human context that gave them something to refer back to, a sense of being loved and known that the Crusade itself rarely provided. Angron had none of this. The world he fell to was Nuceria, and Nuceria was a slave world, and the people who surrounded him there were not family in any nurturing sense. Enemours came closest, but even that relationship existed within conditions of extraordinary deprivation. He never had the experience of being cared for, outside of a context defined by suffering. He never had a home he was taken from, a people who mourned his departure, a childhood that contained anything a child was entitled to. Other Primarchs carried human warmth into the Crusade. Angron carried only the red sand. The difference in what that produced cannot be overstated. Of all the Primarchs, across the full breadth of their varied and often painful origin stories, Angron stands as the one for whom the experience of genuine human kinship, the quiet, unremarkable warmth of being truly known and cared for by another person, was most comprehensively denied. Others suffered. Others were placed in difficult circumstances on difficult worlds. But even in hardship, most found something that approximated connection. Something that told them they were valued as individuals rather than as instruments. Angron did not receive this in any consistent or formative way. The deficit it created was not simply emotional, though it was certainly that. It was cognitive and developmental in a broader sense, shaping how he understood what he could reasonably expect from relationships, what safety felt like, and whether the world outside himself was a place that could be trusted to offer anything other than pain. A person who has never truly experienced being known is not simply sad. They are operating without one of the most fundamental reference points available to human experience. Angron had to construct an understanding of human connection from observation and inference rather than from the lived knowledge of having received it. What he built from those materials was remarkable, but it could never be quite the same thing. The debate that surrounds the Emperor's choices on Nuceria is not one that has a clean resolution. But among those who study the Primarchs and the forces that shaped their eventual fates, there is a serious argument to be made that the pivotal moment in Angron's story was not his fall to chaos, not the heresy, not even the implantation of the nails. It was the moment on Nuceria when the Emperor took him away from the only people he had ever chosen and refused to go back. That single act, or rather that pair of acts, the taking and the refusal, broke something in Angron's relationship to authority and to hope that was never subsequently repaired. The nails were already there. The damage was already in progress. But what remained, what the revolt had demonstrated was still possible, was the capacity to choose a cause and commit to it, and fight for something beyond survival. That capacity needed to be met with something. With acknowledgement, with reciprocity, with at least the gesture of being seen. Instead it was overridden. And the argument, made carefully and with genuine weight, is that this was the moment the trajectory became fixed. Not inevitable in a cosmic sense, but practically irreversible given the man and the damage, and the absence of anything that might have interrupted the arc. This is perhaps the most sobering thought in the whole of Angron's story. Not that he was always going to fall, not that corruption was written into him from birth or from the moment the nails were implanted, but that there existed a specific point, a specific juncture in his history, after which the accumulation of damage and denial and unaddressed grief had reached a level that exceeded what any subsequent intervention could have fully addressed. The window for saving Angron, whatever saving would have looked like in his specific context, may have closed on Nuceria. It did not close because he was irredeemable as a person. The fragments of warmth and principle and loyalty that surfaced throughout his later life argue clearly against that interpretation. It closed because saving him would have required acknowledging the full weight of what had been done to him and making a genuine, sustained, costly effort to address it. And nobody with the power to make that effort ever chose to do so. That is not Angron's failure. It is everybody else's. The tragedy of his story is not that a monster was born. It is that a person in need of help did not receive it, at the moment when help might still have mattered, and the consequences of that failure echoed across 10,000 years of history. The Warhounds become the World Eaters. Before Angron, before the red sand and the butcher's nails and the slow transformation of an entire legion into something the Imperium would come to fear and eventually mourn, there was simply the 12th Legion. And the 12th Legion were called the Warhounds. It is a name worth pausing on, because it carries within it a hint of what they were before their gene-father arrived to reshape them in the image of his own suffering. Hounds are loyal. Hounds are fierce, yes, but they are fierce in service of something beyond themselves. They follow. They protect. They are instruments of a will, greater than their own, and they perform that function with a kind of disciplined devotion that speaks to training and trust rather than to uncontrolled destruction. The Warhounds were regarded as a capable and aggressive but fundamentally functional legion before Angron's arrival. They had commanders who led effectively. They had a culture that, while martial in the extreme, operated within the recognizable parameters of the Great Crusade. They were, in short, a legion that was working. What they became after Angron is well documented. What they were before him is worth remembering, because it underlines again the principle that runs through every element of this story. What the nails destroyed was not inevitable. It was made. When Angron was united with the 12th Legion, the existing command structure did not survive the transition intact. The officers who had led the Warhounds through their early campaigns, who had built the institutional knowledge and the tactical culture of the Legion, found themselves in an impossible position. Their new Genefather was not interested in inheriting a structure he had not built and could not relate to. The Butcher's Nails made sustained cooperation with anyone who did not operate on his specific terms extraordinarily difficult, and the terms Angron operated on were not those of the careful military hierarchy the Legion had developed. Some commanders were killed, in confrontations that the records describe with varying degrees of directness. Others were driven away, removed from positions of influence through a combination of deliberate marginalization and the simple impossibility of continuing to function in an environment shaped entirely by Angron's presence and priorities. What was lost in this process was considerable. Experience, institutional memory, the accumulated practical wisdom of commanders who had learned their craft over years of genuine campaigning. It was replaced by something rawer, more immediate, and far more dangerous. The Legion that emerged from the transition was not better than the one that had entered it. It was simply more thoroughly Angron's. The decision in Angron's tenure as Legion Master that carries the greatest moral weight, and the greatest complexity, was when he ordered the Butcher's Nails implanted into the warriors of the 12th Legion. The technology that had been forced upon him without consent, that had spent years destroying his capacity for peace and connection and emotional regulation, was now to be distributed throughout his sons. The question of how to understand this decision is genuinely difficult. There are interpretations that frame it as deliberate cruelty, as Angron visiting his own suffering upon those beneath him. There are others that suggest something more complicated, that he was attempting to share the only framework he had for understanding warrior purpose, the only mode of existence the Nails had left him capable of fully inhabiting. There is even an argument, dark and uncomfortable, that he wanted his sons to understand what he experienced, to know what it felt like from the inside. None of these interpretations fully accounts for the decision, and perhaps none of them is meant to. What is clear is that the implantation of the Nails into the Legion was a transformation from which there was no return. It was the moment the Warhound ceased to exist in any meaningful sense, and something new and terrible began to take their place. The culture Angron imposed on his Legion was not modeled on the traditions of the Great Crusade or on the martial philosophies of any other Legion. It was modeled on Nuceria, on the arena, on the specific brutal logic of the gladiatorial world that had shaped him, because it was the only world he had ever fully inhabited and the only set of values that the Nails permitted him to consistently access. Pit fights among the Astartes of the 12th Legion became a regular feature of Legion life under his command. Warriors fought one another, not in the controlled context of training, but in something far closer to the actual arena competitions of Nuceria. The purpose, such as it was, mirrored the purpose the arena had served on the red sand. Strength was demonstrated. Hierarchies were established through violence rather than through experience or wisdom. And the Nails, rewarding aggression and punishing the restraint that might have prompted a warrior to question the practice, ensured participation was enthusiastic. What this produced over time was a Legion culture in which the capacity for internal violence was not a failure mode to be managed, but a standard feature of daily existence. The World Eaters did not simply fight enemies. They fought each other, constantly and deliberately, until the line between the two became increasingly difficult to locate. For all the ways in which Angron reshaped the 12th Legion in his own image, there is a painful irony at the center of his relationship with his sons. He never truly bonded with them. The emotional connection that defined the relationships between some Primarchs and their legions, the sense of deep mutual recognition and genuine paternal investment that was visible in figures like Vulcan or the early Horus, was simply not available to Angron in any sustained form. The Nails had made certain of that. The neural pathways through which warmth and connection and the quiet pleasure of belonging might have flowed were the precise pathways the nails had spent years damaging. He could be among his sons. He could lead them, fight beside them, impose his will upon their culture and their bodies and their way of war. But he could not be with them in the way that a father can be with his children. He was always, in the most fundamental sense, alone within their company. This did not make him indifferent to them in every respect. The fragments of evidence suggest he felt something for his legion that was genuine, however distorted and inaccessible it was. But it was not the bond that either he or they might have deserved, and the legion was shaped by that absence as surely as by everything his presence imposed. The practice of decimation has a long history in the military traditions of various cultures. In its classical form, it required that one soldier in every 10 be killed by the remaining 9, as punishment for collective failure or cowardice. It is a practice that speaks to a particular philosophy of command, one in which the welfare of individuals is entirely subordinate to the enforcement of a collective standard, and in which the willingness to inflict suffering on your own forces is treated as a demonstration of seriousness rather than as a failure of leadership. Angron used decimation. Within the 12th Legion, collective failure could result in the Legion turning on itself in the most literal possible way. This was not an abstract threat or a rarely invoked extreme measure. It was part of the operational culture he imposed, reflecting both the Nucerian gladiatorial tradition in which he had been formed, and the specific logic of the nails, which had stripped from him the capacity to respond to failure with anything other than violence. The decimation of his own forces achieved, in a grim and practical sense, the same neurological relief that any act of violence provided. It also sent a message to the survivors that was entirely consistent with the world Angron had grown up in. In Nuceria, weakness was punished. Nothing had changed. Among the various doctrines and policies that Angron imposed upon his legion's way of war, there is one that carries a particular kind of specificity, the kind that speaks to a detail too precise to be accidental. The 31-hour compliance rule, which governed the time within which a planetary target was expected to submit to imperial authority before the full force of the legion was unleashed upon it, was calibrated not to any standard imperial measure or tactical calculation. It was calibrated to Nucerian time. The day on Nuceria, the unit of time within which the rhythms of the arena and the slave circuit had operated, was the measure Angron used to define the boundary between warning and annihilation. This is a detail that operates on multiple levels simultaneously. It is, on the surface, an operational policy like any other. But it is also a piece of Nuceria embedded permanently into the Legion's practice, a trace element of the world that had made Angron, carried forward into every campaign the World Eaters ever fought. In some sense, every planet that received that ultimatum received it from Nuceria, through Angron, across however many light years separated them from the red sand. The arena set the clock. It always had. The refusal to retreat was not simply a tactical preference for Angron. It was a moral position, and one with roots deep enough in his personal history that it had taken on the character of an absolute. On the red sand, retreat was not an option. The arena did not permit it, and even if it had, the logic of gladiatorial survival made withdrawal a sentence as surely as defeat. You survived by standing, by advancing, by consuming the ground between yourself and the threat. Falling back was dying slowly instead of dying quickly, with the added dimension of having abandoned the only leverage available to you. This understanding of combat as a domain in which retreat was not merely inadvisable but fundamentally wrong became, under Angron's command, official Legion policy. The World Eaters did not withdraw. They did not consolidate positions at a distance or trade ground for time in the way that more conventionally managed legions might. They attacked, and then they attacked again, and the only direction available to them was forward. In certain tactical contexts, this produced extraordinary results. The sheer momentum of a force that would not stop was genuinely terrifying and genuinely effective. In others, it produced catastrophic casualties and situations that more flexible doctrine would have managed better. Angron found this trade entirely acceptable. Within the 12th Legion, among thousands of warriors who bore Angron's gene legacy and operated within the culture he had created, one name came to stand apart from all the others in terms of his proximity to the Primarch. Khan of the 8th Assault Company became Angron's closest champion, a figure whose relationship with the Red Angel carried a quality that distinguished it from the functional violence-based hierarchies that defined most of the Legion's internal dynamics. Khan was exceptional even by the standards of a Legion that valued only exceptional things. He was a warrior of extraordinary capability, but he was also something rarer within that context. He retained, longer than almost anyone around him, enough of himself to be genuinely present in a relationship rather than simply effective in a function. Whether Angron recognized this consciously is difficult to say with certainty. But the relationship between Primarch and Champion had a quality of mutual recognition that went beyond tactical utility. Khan was the one who came closest to reaching Angron as a person, in the years of the Great Crusade and the early heresy. He did not succeed in any transformative sense. The damage was too deep and the nails too relentless for that. But he was there. Which was more than almost anyone else managed. Not all of Angron's significant relationships were with warriors of his own legion, and not all of them followed the patterns that his reputation might suggest. Latara Sarin, the captain of the Red Reaver and one of the most capable Void commanders in the World Eater's broader fleet structure, occupied an unusual position in Angron's regard. He treated her with a respect that was, given both his general disposition and the culture he had imposed on those around him, genuinely remarkable. This was not the respect of a superior for a useful subordinate. It was something with more texture than that, something that acknowledged her as a person of consequence whose judgment and presence carried independent weight. The significance of this extends beyond the personal detail. It tells us something about the conditions under which the remnant of Angron's original character could still surface. He was capable of genuine respect. He was capable of recognizing quality in another person and responding to it in a way that was not mediated entirely by the Nails reward system. Those conditions were rare, and they could not be reliably produced or sustained. But they were real. Latara is evidence, as Khan is evidence, that the person the Nails were destroying was still present, still capable of connection, still reaching outward when the grinding allowed it. The final and perhaps most defining feature of Angron's existence within the structure he had built around himself is this. Despite the Legion, despite the champions, despite the occasional flicker of genuine connection, he was always alone. Not in the logistical sense. He was surrounded at almost every moment by thousands of warriors who bore his gene legacy and fought in his name and had been reshaped in the image of his damage. But in the sense that matters most, the sense of being known and accompanied and genuinely less alone because of the presence of others, he remained entirely isolated. The Nails guaranteed this. They disrupted the neural processes through which social connection is experienced as rewarding. They made the sustained vulnerability that genuine intimacy requires, not merely difficult but neurologically inaccessible. And so he moved through a legion he had created, among brothers who feared and admired and in some cases genuinely cared for him, as a figure fundamentally unreachable. The isolation was not of his choosing, any more than the Nails were of his choosing. It was inflicted upon him by the same mechanism that had inflicted everything else. But it was no less complete for being involuntary. The Red Angel stood always at the center of the storm he had become, and always, in the deepest sense, entirely alone within it. The monster of the Great Crusade. The Great Crusade was, in the telling of those who believed in it most fervently, more than a military campaign. It was a project. An attempt to reunite a scattered humanity under the light of reason and collective purpose, to push back the darkness that had accumulated during the long centuries of the Age of Strife and replace it with something better. Many of the Primarchs invested genuinely in this vision. They found in it a framework that gave their extraordinary capabilities a direction they could feel some measure of pride in. A reason that extended beyond the immediate fact of conquest. Angron never found this. The ideals of the Great Crusade, the language of liberation and enlightenment, and the manifest destiny of humanity reclaiming the stars, landed differently for a being whose own liberation had been denied at the moment it became possible, and whose enlightenment consisted largely of understanding exactly how thoroughly he had been used. He fought in the crusade because he had no meaningful choice. He prosecuted campaigns with the ferocity the nails demanded and his nature produced. But the animating belief that gave the crusade its sense of higher purpose never took root in him. You cannot convince a man to believe in liberation as an ideal when you have demonstrated, through your own actions, that his liberation was the one kind you were not prepared to support. There is a military paradox embedded in Angron's nature that the World Eater's history illustrates with uncomfortable clarity. He was among the most physically devastating beings in the galaxy. His capacity for destruction in a direct engagement was almost unparalleled. And yet the very quality that made him so terrifying in a melee, the absolute commitment to violence that the nails produced, simultaneously undermined his effectiveness as a commander in the broader strategic sense. Rage, unbound and unmediated, is not a precision instrument. It does not pause to assess whether the target in front of it is the most valuable target available. It does not calculate the second and third order consequences of destroying something before the destruction is complete. It does not consider withdrawal, regrouping, or the conservation of force as meaningful options. In Angron, these limitations were not simply personal failings that a more disciplined mind might have compensated for. They were hardwired by the nails into the very mechanism of his cognition. The result was a commander who could break almost anything placed directly in front of him, but who frequently failed to convert that local dominance into the kind of strategic advantage that would have made his legion genuinely more effective over time. The hammer was extraordinary, but it only knew how to hammer. Beyond the strategic limitations his condition imposed, there was a more basic and more visceral problem embedded in Angron's neurological reality. The butcher's nails did not simply make him inclined toward violence. They created a situation in which the cessation of violence was physically and neurologically aversive. When Angron was fighting, the nails provided what passed for relief in his experience. When the fighting stopped, that relief was withdrawn, and the baseline state of pain and pressure and unresolvable agitation that the nails produced in the absence of stimulation reasserted itself. This meant that for Angron, ending a battle was not a neutral event. It was the beginning of a period of suffering that would only be addressed when the next engagement began. In practical terms, this manifested as an inability to stand down, that went beyond stubbornness or aggression and into something closer to compulsion. Accounts from those who served near him describe the period following a successful engagement as some of the most dangerous time to be in his vicinity, precisely because the victory that should have produced satisfaction, produced instead a kind of agonized restlessness that sought any available outlet. He could not stop, because stopping hurt, and the nails had ensured there was no other way to feel better, except to begin again. Setting aside the strategic complications and the human cost of what the nails had made of him, there is a dimension of Angron's nature that demands acknowledgement on its own terms. In single combat and in the chaos of close engagement, he was among the most lethal beings the galaxy contained. This is a significant statement in a context that includes figures of extraordinary martial prowess across all 20 Primarchs, each of them a demigod by the standards of ordinary human warriors. Within that company, Angron stood out. His physical capabilities were staggering even by Primarch standards. His speed and strength and endurance exceeded what most of his brothers could match in a sustained close-quarters engagement. But physical capability alone does not fully account for it. What made Angron particularly deadly was the combination of that capability with the absolute absence of self-preservation instinct that the nails produced. He did not fight like a being that valued its own survival. He fought like a being for whom survival was an irrelevant consideration, which meant he was willing to accept costs in an engagement that any rational opponent would refuse. Facing something that has decided the outcome of the fight matters more than whether it lives to see it is a deeply unsettling experience. Most opponents did not survive long enough to fully appreciate it. The image of Angron that solidified in later tellings of his story is predominantly that of a being consumed by the nails to the point where higher cognitive function had been largely displaced by the demands of uncontrolled aggression. And there is substantial basis for that portrayal in the evidence of his later campaigns and his behavior during the heresy. But it is worth noting that earlier accounts of the World Eaters and their Primarch present a somewhat more complicated picture. In older depictions, Angron retained a degree of strategic capability that the later, Nails-dominant version of the character does not always reflect. He could plan. He could assess a tactical situation and make decisions about it that went beyond simply pointing himself at the nearest enemy. The deterioration was real, but it was a deterioration, which implies a prior state of greater functionality. This is important because it adds a temporal dimension to the tragedy. He was not always only the monster the galaxy eventually knew. There was a period, however compromised, in which something more than the nails was still operating. In which the commander existed alongside the berserker, even if the balance was shifting steadily in one direction. Watching that balance shift across the arc of his story is one of the most painful aspects of studying him in detail. In the earliest characterizations that emerged from accounts of his campaigns and his command style, Angron was often framed through the lens of the techno-barbarian warlord. This is a specific archetype in the broader mythology of the Great Crusade, one that speaks to a kind of martial authority rooted not in the refined traditions of galactic civilization but in something older and rawer. The warlord who fights from the front, who rules through demonstrated physical dominance rather than administrative hierarchy, who carries the culture of a harsh and unforgiving world into every engagement and imposes that culture on those around him through the sheer force of example. In Angron's case, that harsh world was Nuceria, and the culture was the arena. This framing captures something true about how he led and how he was perceived by those outside his legion. He was not a Primarch in the mode of the scholar warriors or the diplomat generals. He was closer to a force of nature wearing the rank of a legion master, operating by rules that predated the crusade and would outlast it. The techno-barbarian framing also serves as a reminder that his particular mode of warfare was not unprecedented in the Imperium. It was simply more extreme, and more damaged, than most. There is a distinction that matters in any careful account of Angron, between the aspects of his behavior that were driven by the nails and those that represented his own conscious will, operating independently of their influence. His rage, in its most acute and uncontrolled manifestations, belonged largely to the nails. But his hatred was something different. His hatred of the Nucerians who had enslaved him, his hatred of the systems of authority that had treated him as an instrument, his hatred of the Emperor for the specific choices made on Nuceria, these were not products of neurological compulsion. They were considered. They were maintained across decades with a consistency that spoke to ongoing conscious investment. He had not simply been swept into hatred by a brain that could no longer distinguish between stimuli. He had looked at the facts of his life, assessed them, and arrived at conclusions about who and what deserved his hatred, and he held those conclusions with the tenacity of a person who has earned them. This distinction matters because it preserves Angron's moral agency in a story that could easily reduce him entirely to a victim of forces beyond his control. He was that, in important ways. But he was also a person who made choices, who maintained positions, who directed his will toward specific objects. His hatred was his own. Loyalty among the Primarchs was a complex and variable quality, shaped by individual temperament, by the relationships formed during the Great Crusade, and ultimately by the choices made when the heresy presented each of them with a decision about where they stood. For many, loyalty to the Emperor or to Horus was the product of genuine emotional investment, of bonds that had been built over years of shared purpose. Angron's relationship to loyalty of this kind was almost entirely absent. He was not loyal to the Emperor in any meaningful emotional sense, because the Emperor had given him no foundation on which to build such loyalty. He was not loyal to the Crusades' ideals, for the reasons already discussed. He was not even particularly loyal to Horus, despite eventually fighting under his banner, because his motivations for fighting in the heresy were rooted in his own consistent convictions rather than in any personal devotion to the War Master. What loyalty Angron possessed was of the kind forged on the red sand, extending to individuals who had earned his trust through shared suffering and demonstrated commitment. This was genuine and it was deep, but it was also narrow, and it operated entirely outside the institutional frameworks that the Primarchs were supposed to embody. He was loyal to people, occasionally. He was loyal to nothing else. At some point during the Great Crusade, the Emperor conducted a direct examination of the damage the butcher's nails had inflicted on Angron's neurological architecture. This was not a distant assessment or a report from the Mechanicum, delivered through intermediaries. The Emperor looked directly at what had been done to his son, at the cellular scarring and the severed pathways and the ongoing grinding destruction that the nails continued to produce with every passing day. The word mutilated is used here with full awareness of its weight. What the Emperor found was not damage in the sense of unfortunate but manageable impairment. It was mutilation in the surgical sense, the deliberate and systematic destruction of specific capacities. The examination was, in its own way, a moment of profound consequence, because it meant that everything the Emperor did or failed to do afterward occurred with full knowledge of what Angron was experiencing. There was no subsequent claim to ignorance available. The father had seen the wound. He understood its depth and its origins and its ongoing effects. What he chose to do with that knowledge, and what he chose not to do, are questions that the examination makes impossible to avoid. The butcher's nails were not designed for a Primarch's physiology, and the mismatch was not merely a matter of suboptimal performance. It was a matter of biological incompatibility that had a clear and terminal trajectory. The nails were killing Angron. Slowly, across years and decades, the ongoing interference they produced in his neural tissue was causing cumulative damage that exceeded the extraordinary regenerative capacity even a Primarch possessed. The rate of destruction outpaced the rate of repair. Each passing year brought him incrementally closer to a threshold beyond which his biology could no longer compensate. This is a detail that reframes every subsequent year of the Great Crusade and the early heresy. Every campaign fought, every battle won, every act of destruction and every moment of isolated suffering occurred against this background. Angron was not simply a damaged being, living with a chronic condition. He was a being with a countdown embedded in his skull, grinding away at the hours and the years with the same relentless patience it had always applied to everything else. He knew this, or came to know it. What it meant to live with that knowledge, on top of everything else the nails produced, is something that resists easy description. The conclusion reached by those who examined Angron, including the Emperor himself, was not that the damage was severe and would require significant effort to address. It was that the damage was irreversible. That the cellular and structural changes wrought by the nails over the years of their operation had passed the point beyond which restoration was possible. There was no procedure available, no intervention within the reach of even the most advanced technology the Imperium possessed, that could have returned Angron to anything approximating what he had been designed to be. The pathways were gone. The architecture had been rebuilt around their absence. The man who might have been the Emperor's paladin son existed only in the genetic template that had never been fully expressed, and that template was no longer a guide to anything that could be recovered. This conclusion carries with it a particular kind of grief, because it closes the door on a category of hope that the story of Angron might otherwise seem to hold open. There is no version of events in which the right intervention at the right moment restores him. There is only what was done, and what it cost, and the long reckoning with the fact that the cost was paid by someone who had never agreed to bear it. We return here to the detail that cuts through everything else with the particular sharpness of a truth that cannot be argued away. The Emperor examined his son's mind. He saw the damage and understood its origins. He traced the chain of causes back through the nails and the arena and the revolt and the teleportation and the deaths on Nuceria, and he arrived at a conclusion he apparently acknowledged, at least in private. The rage was justified. Angron's fury was not a pathology without a referent. It was not free-floating aggression in search of a target. It was a proportionate response to a specific and sustained catalogue of wrongs, amplified beyond all measure by technology designed to prevent it from ever resolving, but rooted in something real. The Emperor knew this. And knowing it, he continued. The crusade continued. The legion continued. Angron continued to be pointed at the enemy with the nails still in his head and the dead of Nuceria still unacknowledged, and the Emperor, who knew his rage was justified, chose not to let that knowledge change anything in any meaningful way. It is perhaps the most damning fact in a story full of damning facts. Not that the Emperor was ignorant of his son's suffering, but that he was not. The Horus heresy. The final betrayal. When Horus began the careful, deliberate work of assembling the coalition that would become the Warmaster's rebellion, the order in which allegiances were secured tells its own story. And there is a credible argument, supported by certain readings of the available accounts, that Angron was among the very first of the Primarchs to be brought to Horus's side. This is not as surprising as it might initially appear. Horus did not need to seduce Angron with promises of power or whispered corruptions from the Chaos Gods. He did not need to construct an elaborate theological or ideological argument. He needed only to offer Angron what the Emperor had failed to provide: acknowledgement, recognition that the grievances were real, a framework in which Angron's fury was not a problem to be managed but a force to be directed toward a purpose he could actually believe in. Horus was a supremely gifted reader of his brothers, and he understood what Angron needed well enough to provide a credible version of it. Whether this constitutes genuine alliance in the full sense is debatable. Angron did not fight for Horus out of devotion to the Warmaster's vision. He fought because the alternative was continuing to serve the being he held responsible for everything that had been done to him. That was sufficient. The twin atrocities of Istvan marked the point at which the heresy moved from conspiracy to open war, and Angron was present at both. Istvan III, where the loyalist elements of the traitor legions were destroyed in a deliberate and methodical purge, and Istvan V, the drop site massacre, where 3 legions were lured into a trap and systematically slaughtered, represent 2 of the most significant military events of the entire conflict. At Istvan V in particular, Angron's role was not peripheral. The World Eaters were among the forces that fell upon the loyalist legions as the trap closed, and the particular quality of violence the 12th Legion brought to that engagement was consistent with everything the nails and years of Angron's command had produced in them. They did not take prisoners. They did not accept surrender. They pressed the engagement with the kind of absolute commitment to destruction that made them genuinely terrifying even to the other traitor forces witnessing them. Angron at Istvan was not a general managing a battle. He was a force moving through a battlefield, and the distinction between those two things was, by this point in his story, more or less absolute. The heresy had found its most willing instrument. It would be a mistake to read Angron's participation in the Horus heresy primarily as an ideological commitment or a strategic calculation. The frameworks that motivated other Primarchs to turn against the Emperor, the promises of chaos, the resentment of the Council of Nicaea, the wounded pride of those who felt overlooked or undervalued, these were not Angron's primary drivers. His rebellion was personal in a way that predated the heresy by decades and would have found an outlet eventually, regardless of whether Horus had provided the specific occasion for it. He was not fighting for a new order or a different kind of Imperium. He was fighting against a specific being who had committed specific acts that he had never forgiven and never been given any reason to forgive. The Emperor was not, to Angron, an abstract symbol of a system he opposed. He was the individual who had stood on Nuceria and made a choice, and who had then spent years demonstrating through inaction that the choice had been made without remorse. The heresy gave Angron a direction for something that had always been present. It did not create the motivation. It simply opened the door and stood aside. The philosophical position Angron held toward the Imperium was not complicated, and it was not, given the specifics of his experience, difficult to understand. He had been a slave. He understood with a clarity that came from direct and sustained experience exactly what slavery looked like, how it operated, what it required of those it owned, and what it took from them. And when he looked at the Imperium, at its hierarchies and its demands and its conscription of individuals into purposes they had not chosen, he saw the same structure wearing different clothes. This was not a naive or unsophisticated assessment, though it was not a fully nuanced one either. The Imperium was many things simultaneously, and reducing it entirely to a mechanism of control ignores the genuine complexity of what the Emperor was attempting to build. But from Angron's specific vantage point, from the experience of having been conscripted into it against his will at the moment of his greatest vulnerability, the parallel was not abstract. He had not chosen the Great Crusade. He had not agreed to lead a legion. He had been taken, as he had always been taken, and handed a role he had not requested. The costume had changed. The fundamental relationship had not. He never pretended otherwise, and in his particular case, the pretense would have been difficult to sustain. There is a progression in Angron's story that is painful to trace in detail, because it charts the narrowing of whatever interior space remained available to the person he had been. In his earliest days on Nuceria, the nails were present, but he retained enough of himself to lead, to plan, to form attachments and maintain convictions. By the time of his reunion with the Emperor, that space had already shrunk considerably. Through the decades of the Great Crusade, it continued to shrink. And by the time of the heresy, the point of no return in terms of the capacity for restraint had been passed. He was not choosing to be unrestrained in the way that a person with full agency chooses to act. The neurological infrastructure required to make restraint possible had been ground away to the point of functional absence. This is not an excuse in any conventional moral sense, because the actions he took and the destruction he enabled carried real consequences for real people regardless of their internal origin. But it is a distinction that matters for understanding him correctly. The Angron who burned and destroyed during the heresy was not a man who had decided restraint was no longer worth practicing. He was a man for whom the capacity to practice it had been methodically removed over the course of a lifetime. As Angron's mortal existence approached its terminal phase, the nails grinding him toward a threshold his body could no longer sustain, the blood god moved. Khorne had watched his most perfect instrument approaching the limit of its mortal endurance, and offered what gods of his particular nature offer to those they wish to keep: a weapon. The Black Blade, a gift from the blood god himself, arrived in Angron's possession as something more than a sword. It was a marker of favor, a sign that the relationship between the slave of rage and the god of it had moved into a new and more formal register. A chaos weapon of this kind is never simply a tool. It is a covenant-made material, a binding expressed in metal and intent that ties the bearer more securely to the patron than any spoken oath could achieve. Angron took the blade. Given everything the nails had already done to his capacity for autonomous decision-making, it is perhaps academic to ask whether he was truly in a position to refuse. What matters is what the blade represented in the arc of his story. It was the moment at which Khorne's investment in him became explicit and concrete, and the direction of travel became, if it had not already been, entirely clear. The black blade that Khorne placed in Angron's hands acquired a significance that extended far beyond its role as a weapon of war. In the events that followed its arrival, it became tied to Sanguinius, the Primarch of the Blood Angels, in a way that wove the two figures together in the mythology of the heresy with a permanence that neither could have fully anticipated. The details of that connection vary across accounts, but the essential thread is consistent. The blade and the angel became linked, in the way that certain objects and certain people become linked through the specific violence they enact upon each other, leaving marks that endure beyond the immediate encounter. Sanguinius was one of the most beloved of the Primarchs, a figure who carried within him a doom he had foreseen and accepted with a grace that defined him. The entanglement of his fate with Angron's through the medium of that blade is one of the heresy's most layered ironies. The most tragic of the fallen and the most beloved of the loyal, bound together by a weapon given by a god whose only interest in either of them was the blood they could produce. It is the kind of detail that the Horus heresy generates with a frequency that never quite loses its capacity to resonate. Among beings who were each, individually, among the most formidable warriors in the galaxy, there existed a further hierarchy of martial capability that only became fully apparent in the direct confrontations the heresy produced. And within that hierarchy, Angron occupied a position that gave pause even to his brothers. His melee power, already extraordinary before his ascension, had reached a level by the time of the heresy that placed him in a category that very few could credibly contest. This was the product of multiple converging factors. The nails had stripped away any instinct toward self-preservation that might have moderated his engagement style. The black blade added a dimension of chaotic potency that went beyond the physical. And the decades of sustained combat, of never retreating and never holding back and never treating any engagement as something to be survived rather than consumed, had produced a warrior whose technical capability in close combat was matched by a complete absence of the hesitation that even the most skilled fighters typically carry into an encounter. Facing Angron in melee was not a tactical problem to be solved. It was a reckoning to be survived, and the number of beings in the galaxy capable of surviving it was, by the time of the heresy, extremely small. The ascension of Angron to demonhood, the moment when the nails finally killed the body they had been destroying for so long, and Khorne caught what remained and remade it into something vast and terrible, produced an outcome that is genuinely counterintuitive given everything that preceded it. He became more lucid. The demon Angron, the enormous and horrifying entity that emerged from the apotheosis, on Armageddon and elsewhere, was in certain measurable respects more coherent, more capable of sustained thought and deliberate intent, than the mortal Angron had been in his final years. This is not a comfortable detail, because it disturbs the narrative logic that might otherwise allow the demon to be simply a monster with no connection to the person who preceded it. The lucidity suggests continuity. It suggests that something recognizably Angron survived the transformation, and that the transformation itself, whatever else it cost, released him from the specific neurological prison the nails represented. The nails had been killing him. They are gone now, subsumed into something larger. And in their absence, a version of his mind that the nails had been suppressing, was in some horrible and ironic sense, free to operate again. Whether that constitutes any kind of mercy is a question the lore invites but does not answer. Following directly from the question of his lucidity comes a more disturbing possibility that certain accounts and certain readings of his post-ascension behavior make difficult to dismiss entirely. There is an argument, made quietly and with appropriate discomfort, that the demon Angron is in some meaningful sense, more authentically himself than the mortal Angron was in his final decades. Not more good. Not more redeemable. Not closer to the paladin the Emperor designed. But more present. More capable of the kind of deliberate directed existence that the nails had been systematically preventing for so long. The nails did not allow him to be himself. They allowed him to be a function, a pain-driven mechanism for producing violence. The demon, liberated from the nails by the simple fact of no longer possessing a mortal brain for them to destroy, operates with a coherence that the mortal version had largely lost. If this interpretation is correct, it is one of the most bitter ironies in his entire story. The only form of existence in which Angron could think clearly enough to be recognizably Angron was the one that required his damnation. The liberation came too late, in the wrong form, at a price that transformed everything it was meant to free. In the vast and blood-soaked roster of Khorne's servants, across 10,000 years of galactic history, there is no shortage of figures defined by violence and loss. The blood god collects such figures as a matter of design. But Angron stands apart even in that company, not because of the scale of his destruction, though that is considerable, and not because of the purity of his devotion to bloodshed, though the nails ensured that was never in question. He stands apart because of what was visible, always, beneath the surface of what he had become. The tragedy of Khorne's most powerful demon prince is that he was never truly Khorne's. Not in the way that a willing servant is their master's. He was taken, shaped by suffering into something the blood god could use, and then claimed at the moment of his body's failure by a power that had been patient enough to wait for exactly this outcome. The champion who burns across the battlefields of the 41st millennium is not a man who chose this. He is the end product of a chain of choices made by others, stretching back to a slave world and a set of crude neural implants and an emperor who knew and did not act. He is tragedy wearing the face of a god. He is the monument to everything that was refused him, made permanent and given teeth. The eternal slaughter. In the long aftermath of the heresy, in the 10,000 years of conflict and ruin that followed the Emperor's interment upon the Golden Throne, Angron did not simply dissolve into the broader chaos of a galaxy at war. He organized, after a fashion. The Dominion of Fire was the name given to the sphere of influence and destruction that gathered around him in the years following his ascension, a region of space defined not by borders or administrations or any of the conventional markers of territorial power, but by the simple fact of his presence and the devastation that presence produced. To call it a dominion in the political sense would be misleading. Angron was not interested in governance. He was not building an empire in any recognizable form. But the word captures something real about the gravitational quality of his existence in this period. Things organized themselves around him. Other servants of the blood god were drawn toward him. Warbands and fleets and individual champions who sought proximity to the most powerful of Khorne's servants found their way into his orbit. The Dominion of Fire was less a political entity than a weather system with Angron at its eye, a zone of perpetual violence that moved through the galaxy with the terrible consistency of something that has entirely given up on any purpose other than the one it serves. The period following his ascension and the consolidation of the Dominion of Fire was not defined by campaigns in the conventional military sense. There were no objectives secured and then held, no territories pacified, no strategic goals pursued across a timetable with an endpoint in mind. What there was, sustained across a period that by certain reckonings extended to approximately 2 centuries, was simply slaughter. Continuous, unbroken, without the pauses for resupply or consolidation or any of the other necessities that govern the warfare of mortal armies. A demon Primarch does not require rest. He does not require food or water or the logistical infrastructure that limits what flesh and blood forces can sustain. He requires only the one thing the galaxy has never been short of providing: enemies. And for 2 centuries, the galaxy provided them in sufficient quantity to sustain something that can only be described as an ongoing catastrophe rather than a series of discrete military events. The scale of it resists easy comprehension. 2 centuries is longer than the entire recorded history of many of the worlds the Imperium contains. The idea that a single entity moved through that span of time doing nothing but killing, without pause, without mercy, without any indication that it would ever stop, communicates something about the nature of demonhood that theology struggles to fully express. In the scattered and fragmented state of the World Eaters as a legion in the post-heresy era, unity was not a quality that came naturally. The 12th Legion had never been particularly cohesive even under Angron's direct command during the Crusade, and the heresy and its aftermath had broken what coherence they possessed into individual warbands operating largely independently across the Eye of Terror and beyond. But Angron, as a demon Primarch, exerted a pull on these scattered elements that operated with something approaching physical regularity. World Eaters warbands that had spent decades operating autonomously found themselves drawn, through routes that were not always consciously chosen, toward wherever Angron happened to be. The pull was not ideological. It was not the result of coordinated communication or deliberate strategic alignment. It was something more instinctive than that, rooted in the gene legacy that connected every World Eater to their Primarch regardless of the centuries of separation between them. Near Angron, the nails sang differently. Near Angron, the specific quality of violence that defined the World Eaters was amplified and focused in ways that even the most solitary warband leader found difficult to resist. He did not recruit his sons. He simply existed, and they arrived, drawn by something in their blood they could neither explain nor refuse. The distinction between a military commander and a force of nature is, in most contexts, a clear one. A commander makes decisions, assesses situations, chooses between options, manages the relationship between their objectives and the resources available to pursue them. A force of nature does none of these things. It simply moves, according to properties intrinsic to itself, and the consequences are what they are. By the time of his full demonic existence, Angron had moved entirely into the second category. He did not command the forces that gathered around him in any operational sense. He did not brief them on objectives or coordinate their movements toward strategic ends. He moved, and they followed. He fought, and they fought. He turned his attention toward a target, and the combined weight of everything in his orbit turned with him. This is not a diminishment of his potency. In certain contexts it makes him more dangerous than a conventional commander would be, because forces of nature are not susceptible to the feints and deceptions that a thinking adversary can be led into. You cannot misdirect something that is not directing itself. You cannot create a false opportunity for something that is not looking for opportunities. Angron simply moves, and whatever stands in the path of his movement is destroyed. The simplicity of it is, in its own way, terrifying. Within the cosmology of chaos, the relationship between a god and their champions is not a straightforward one of affection or investment in the conventional sense. The chaos gods do not love their servants. They use them, reward useful performance, and discard what ceases to be functional. But there are degrees of regard within that framework, and certain champions occupy a position of particular value to their patron that goes beyond mere usefulness. There is a compelling argument that Angron occupies exactly this position for Khorne. He is not simply a powerful servant or a reliable instrument of destruction. He may be, in the Blood God's assessment, the closest thing to perfection that his particular domain can produce. A being who was shaped entirely by suffering into something that cannot be anything other than what it is. A champion who requires no management, no persuasion, no promises of reward or threats of punishment to perform the function he exists to perform. He does not serve Khorne. He simply is what Khorne values, in its purest possible expression. A god who collects rage could not design a more complete embodiment of his domain than a being who has never, in the entire span of his existence, been permitted to experience anything other than it. Angron is not Khorne's best weapon. He may be Khorne's thesis statement. The nature of demonic existence in the warp is not easily described in terms that translate cleanly to mortal understanding. Time operates differently there. Identity is more fluid, more subject to the currents of psychic energy that define that realm. Periods of material manifestation, when a demon is summoned or crosses into real space through a tear in the fabric of space, are separated by intervals of warp existence that bear no necessary relationship to the duration experienced in the physical universe. What Angron does during those intervals is a matter of inference rather than direct observation. But the logic of what he is and what he was made to be points toward a consistent conclusion. There is no version of Angron that rests. There is no interval in his existence during which the fundamental drive the nails installed and Khorne subsequently claimed and amplified, simply pauses and allows him something other than what it has always produced. The warp is not a place of stillness for a being like him. It is simply a different arena. Different opponents perhaps, or the same battles replaying in the particular way the warp has of cycling through the echoes of what has been. He may be fighting right now, in the space between his manifestations in real space, in a realm where the fighting never runs out of material and never approaches anything resembling an end. The eternal conflict between the Chaos Gods, the great game of dominance and territory and influence that defines the politics of the warp, is not a struggle that any of its participants can opt out of or observe from a distance. Every significant servant of chaos is, whether they are aware of it or not, a piece in a game whose stakes and whose rules extend far beyond any individual's comprehension. Angron serves a role in this game, in a way that goes beyond simply being a powerful weapon that Khorne can point at enemies in real space. His existence as the most powerful and most comprehensively devoted of Khorne's demon primarchs makes him a statement in the ongoing argument between the Blood God and his rivals, about the nature and the value of what each of them represents. Every world Angron destroys is a world that does not fall to plague or madness or the slow corruption of Tzeentch's schemes. Every act of absolute destruction he commits is an argument, made in the language of consequence, for the particular kind of power Khorne embodies. He is not a pawn in the great game. He is closer to an axiom, a piece of evidence for a position rather than a player making choices within it. Whether he knows this, whether in his increased lucidity as a demon he has any awareness of the role he serves, is one of the more unsettling questions his story raises. The First War for Armageddon stands as one of the most devastating invasions the Imperium endured in the post-heresy era, and Angron's role in it was central. But within the broader military narrative of that conflict, there is a detail that interrupts the expected logic of the campaign in a way that reveals something about the priorities of a demon primarch that pure military analysis cannot account for. Angron paused. Not because of imperial resistance that had exceeded his capacity to overcome. Not because of strategic necessity or logistical constraint or any of the conventional reasons a military force might halt its advance. He paused the destruction of Armageddon to construct monuments to Khorne. Great and terrible structures, built from the materials of a world being consumed, dedicated to the glory of the Blood God in the specific ritual language that chaos worship requires. The military implications of this pause were significant. It gave the defenders time and it created opportunities that a continuous advance would not have permitted. But the pause was not made in ignorance of these implications. It was made because for Angron, as for all servants of chaos operating at his level of devotion, the ritual obligation to honor the patron is not secondary to the military objective. In a very real sense, it is the military objective. The monuments were the point. The slaughter was the offering. Armageddon was, from his perspective, a religious act. The campaign on Armageddon did not pass without cost to Angron, even given the extraordinary nature of his demonic existence. The Black Blade, Khorne's gift, the weapon that had been tied to Sanguinius and that had accompanied him through the events of the heresy and beyond, was shattered during the fighting on Armageddon. The specifics of how this occurred vary across accounts, and the precise engagement in which it happened is described with the inconsistency that tends to characterize the most significant moments in the lore. But the fact of it is consistent. The weapon was destroyed. For a demon Primarch, the loss of a weapon given directly by their patron god is not simply a logistical inconvenience. It is a rupture in the symbolic and metaphysical structure of their relationship with that patron. The blade was not merely a tool. It was a covenant. Its shattering on Armageddon represents one of the few moments in Angron's post-ascension story where something genuinely diminished him, where the campaign extracted something from him that could not simply be regenerated by the demon's biology. What replaced it, or whether Khorne has since furnished him with something comparable, is a question the accounts leave open with the particular studied ambiguity that tends to surround the most interesting details. After his defeat on Armageddon, after the combined efforts of the Space Wolves and the Grey Knights and the defenders of the Hiveworld managed what almost nothing else in history had managed, and drove him back from real space, Angron did not simply cease to be a concern. He was not destroyed. He was banished. Returned to the warp in the way that demons can be banished when sufficient force is brought to bear against their material manifestation. But banishment, in the cosmology of Warhammer, is not an ending. It is a delay. And in Angron's case, the delay is precisely calibrated in a way that speaks to the particular numerological significance of the number 8 within Khorne's domain. He returns every 8 weeks, 8 days, and 8 hours. The precision of that interval is itself a kind of statement. It says that he cannot be kept out permanently. It says that the victory achieved at Armageddon has a specific expiration date that repeats, reliably, on a schedule that the Imperium can calculate but cannot alter. And it says that somewhere in the warp, the Red Angel is not waiting passively for the interval to complete. He is fighting, and counting, and the next return is always approaching with the unhurried certainty of mathematics. 8 weeks. 8 days. 8 hours. Then the door opens again. The final tragedy. We come now to the end of Angron's story, or at least to the end of the part of it that this telling has traced. And it feels right to begin the ending where the beginning should have been. With the person he might have been. With the quality that the genetic template, the Emperor's original design, and the fragments of behavior that survived even the worst the nails could do, all point toward, in the same quiet direction. He may once have been noble. Not noble in the heraldic sense, not noble as a title or a rank or a performance of courtly virtue. Noble in the older and more fundamental meaning of the word. Possessed of a genuine moral seriousness. Capable of placing something beyond himself at the center of his actions and serving it without requiring reward. The evidence for this is fragmentary and circumstantial, filtered through accounts that were often recorded by people who encountered him at his most damaged. But it is consistent. The principles he maintained on Nuceria. The loyalty he extended to those beneath him. The grief he felt when the nails forced him to betray those principles. The warmth that surfaced, rare and precious, in his interactions with the very few people who managed to reach him. These are not the traits of a being without nobility. They are the traits of a being whose nobility was being destroyed, slowly and deliberately, by something it had never consented to carry. There is a dimension of speculation in Angron's story that is darker and more uncomfortable than most, and it concerns the specific nature of the empathy that his genetic design may have included. If that empathy was real, if it was a deliberate component of what the Emperor built into him, then the question of its intended purpose deserves to be asked directly. Some interpretations suggest that Angron may have been designed not merely to feel the pain of others in the passive sense, but to absorb it. To be a being capable of taking suffering into himself and processing it, in ways that would have served the broader project of the Great Crusade in ways that are difficult to fully explain. A Primarch who could carry the weight of what the Crusade asked of ordinary human beings. A leader who could be present with suffering rather than simply directing operations from a distance, insulated from it. Whether this interpretation is correct is impossible to verify. But if it contains any truth, the irony of what actually happened to him is almost too large to sit with. A being who may have been designed to bear the pain of others was instead given pain of his own that exceeded anything he was ever designed to carry. He did not absorb the suffering of his legion and his age. He became its most complete expression. The vessel that was meant to receive the weight of others was filled beyond capacity with his own. Following from this possibility, there is a reimagining of Angron available that is rarely entertained precisely because it is so far removed from what he became. If empathy was his true gift, then the Red Angel, the Demon Prince, the Lord of the Red Sands, the Eater of Cities, all of it, represents not the expression of his nature but the inversion of it. His truest self was not the berserker. His truest self was something capable of genuine connection, of understanding what another person carried and responding to it in a way that made them feel less alone in carrying it. The nails took this and turned it inside out. They made him a receiver of his own pain rather than of others, and they made that pain unresolvable, so that what was meant to flow outward as care had nowhere to go, and simply accumulated. The empathy did not disappear. It was redirected, against him, until the capacity that should have been his greatest gift became the mechanism of his most complete destruction. A being designed to understand suffering became a being who could do nothing but experience it endlessly, without the outlet of connection that understanding is meant to provide. Everything he might have given to the people around him was turned inward instead, and burned. Strip away the mythology and the cosmology and the grand sweep of the Horus heresy, and at the center of Angron's story is something remarkably specific and remarkably grim. A piece of technology destroyed him. Not a god, not a cosmic force, not an inevitable spiritual corruption that no amount of care could have prevented. A crude, poorly calibrated, barbarically conceived set of neural implants, designed by slavers for the purpose of making enslaved people easier to manage, and more profitable to display, was inserted into the brain of a Primarch and left to run. That is what the butcher's nails were. That is the mundane reality behind the legend. They were not a weapon of war or a tool of chaos. They were a control mechanism. They were the kind of thing that people who own other people invent, when the people they own refuse to stop being people. And they worked. Not because Angron was weak or susceptible or lacking in the qualities that might have resisted them. They worked because they were physical. Because they operated on tissue and chemistry, and electrical pathways that exist below the level at which will and principle and identity can intervene. He could not think his way past them. He could not choose his way around them. They simply ran, and he ran with them, and the person he had been designed to become was consumed in the running. There is a terrible circularity to Angron's story that makes it feel, on reflection, less like a tragedy with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and more like a loop with no exit. He was born into a world that enslaved him. He fought for years to build something within that slavery that resembled freedom, genuine, chosen freedom, built on real bonds with real people and directed toward a real purpose. He came within reach of it. He was removed from it at the moment of its fullest expression. He was given to a legion and a crusade he had not chosen, which was its own form of bondage. He fell to chaos, which was another form of bondage. He ascended to demonhood, which was presented in the language of power and transcendence, but which bound him more completely to Khorne's purpose than any slave collar on Nuceria had ever bound him to the arena. At every stage of his existence, the forms changed. The institution changed. The being or the system doing the owning changed. And the essential relationship remained constant. Angron was always someone else's instrument. He was born a slave, conscripted as a son, used as a weapon, and claimed as a champion, and at no point in the entire length of his existence was he ever simply, unambiguously, allowed to be free. The Red Angel is the longest-held slave in the history of the galaxy. When the histories of the Horus heresy are written, the Primarchs who fell are often framed through the lens of ambition, of pride reaching beyond what it was entitled to claim, of desire for power or recognition or a significance greater than what the Emperor's order permitted. And for many of them, this framing holds. There is genuine hubris in the stories of several of the fallen. There is recognizable self-aggrandizement, the kind of motivated reasoning that allows a person to convince themselves that what they want is also what is right. Angron does not fit this framing. His fall was not ambitious. It was exhausted. It was the end point of a process that had been running since before he had any real capacity to resist it, the inevitable conclusion of years of unaddressed suffering, meeting a universe that had consistently demonstrated its indifference to that suffering with remarkable thoroughness. He did not fall because he reached for something he should not have had. He fell because he was never given what he should always have had, and because the absence of it, compounded across decades and amplified by technology designed to make absence feel like agony, eventually consumed everything that might have held him. The tragedy of his fall is not that a great man chose wrongly. It is that a damaged man was never given the conditions in which a right choice was possible. We end here, with two words that sit in uncomfortable proximity to each other, and that between them capture everything that makes Angron's story so difficult to look at directly and so impossible to look away from. Irredeemable. Pitiable. The first word acknowledges what is true and what the full arc of his story demonstrates without ambiguity. There is no version of events available to him now. There is no intervention possible, no act of mercy conceivable within the cosmology he inhabits, that would restore him to anything approaching what he was designed to be, or even to the damaged but present person who led a revolt on the red sand and howled in grief over the body of the closest thing he had to a father. That person is gone. The demon that remains is permanent in the way that damnation in this universe tends to be permanent, which is to say completely. And the second word, pitiable. Not in the condescending sense of a superior regarding an inferior with tolerant sympathy. In the true sense. Worthy of pity. Deserving of the specific grief that is reserved for those whose suffering was not earned and not chosen and not necessary. He did not deserve any of it. Not the nails, not Nuceria, not the teleportation, not the legion, not the heresy, not the apotheosis. None of it was what he was made for. None of it was what he would have chosen. And the universe gave it to him anyway, without apology, without acknowledgement, without end. He was simply broken, and the galaxy has bled for it ever since. Remember that. As you rest.